In the last two sessions, we have talked about how people develop across the lifespan in both psychological and spiritual development. In this session, we will see how the insights of psychology can help us understand the mechanisms of growth, how we become whole and healthy people. Earlier in this unit, we talked about the goal, the ultimate purpose of monastic life. We mentioned images and concepts like purity of heart and dwelling in God's tent. Throughout this program, we will see how monastic life is designed to bring us to transformation. As we conclude this section on the journey into monastic life, we will use the insights of psychology to help us understand how we come to transformation. At the beginning of the rule, Benedict says, "This message of mine is for you then, if you are ready to give up your will once and for all." It's probably a good thing that we usually gloss over this statement pretty quickly and don't spend much time on it. If we did, we might change our minds about embarking on this spiritual journey. What Benedict is suggesting is something that is at the root of most major religions, the reality that we have to surrender our basic sense of self-will, our autonomy, our sense of being in complete control of our lives, in order to allow God to be the real center of our self. Let's unpack this idea. We probably all say that we want to grow in faith, that we want to change and do what it takes to have a deeper relationship with God. We say we want God to be at the center of our lives. But what is it that allows us to change, and what makes us resist change? Why is it that even when we want to be different, that we find it so hard to change? We are all on the journey to being remade in the image of Christ, but what are the obstacles on the way? We will begin with this diagram to help us understand the big picture of transformation, and then we will look at each concept at greater depth. Notice the center of this diagram is God. As human beings, we are created in the image of God, and in Christ, God shared our humanity. Our journey on earth is to come to know ourselves as beloved children of God. Further, God is always at work in us, helping us to bring about this realization of who we really are, that we share in the image and likeness of God. And so in the center of the diagram, we see that God is present and working in us and through us. The power and presence of God radiates out into all aspects of our being. God's love is always working to lead us to the deep truth of our being, the reality that we are beloved of God and worthy of love. This action of God is always at work in us, whether we recognize it or not. God is always calling us to God's self. And so the arrows represent this work, this initiative of God, radiating out into all aspects of our life. Even if we aren't conscious of God working in and through us, it is always happening. However, we also know the reality of separation from God. We know the reality of sin in the world and in our lives. We may want to know God more deeply, but we're unsure how that can happen. We may know in an intellectual way that we are loved by God and lovable, but we may not feel it. This is where the other aspects of the diagram come into play. The insights of psychology can help us understand why it is so difficult to come to transformation, to truly know ourselves as created in the image of God. In looking at the diagram, we see the concentric circles that represent what keep us from our core, our truest selves. The arrows indicate that we have to work on going ever deeper into understanding ourselves and stripping away all that keeps us from God. We will explain each piece in greater depth, but briefly, the outer circle is our persona, the roles we play, the masks we wear as part of how we function in the world. We will see that we tend to so over-identify with our masks and roles that we can no longer see who we really are. Below the level of the persona, the outward roles we play, is the ego, which is our fundamental sense of self. The ego is the part of ourself that allows us to function in the world. It is also the part of ourself that likes being in control and tends to resist the action of God. Next, as we go more deeply, we see the subconscious or the shadow parts of ourselves. These are the aspects, the characteristics that we want to deny, that we repress, that we want to say aren't part of who we really are. Unfortunately, denying or repressing them doesn't make them go away. And finally, we see the unconscious, the aspects of ourselves that we are completely unaware of. So let's begin with this idea of the persona. An important idea from contemporary psychology is that how we act, behave, and even see ourselves is often different than who we really are on a deep level. Some of this is common sense. We all have to do a certain amount of acting to function in daily life. If you don't want to go to a party that you're invited to, but you know that it is an important social obligation, then you go and act as if you're glad to be there. Daily life requires that we play roles that may not express who we really are or how we really feel or think. So the persona is the mask or role we play. It is the face we project to the world. It is how we behave in public and is often who we really want to be. The problem is that we begin to identify so strongly with the roles that we play that we begin to think we really are the role we play. For example, if we feel very strongly that there are certain very clear ways that a good Christian must be and behave, then we may strongly repress any feelings or experiences or parts of ourselves that don't conform to our idea of what a good Christian does. This means that any anger, jealousy, doubts, hatred, or other emotions that don't fit with our self-image are denied and not acknowledged. When we spend so much time and energy identifying with our persona, with the mask we wear, the role we play, we may come to a point where we don't really know who we are. We can't recognize and admit that we aren't completely who we want to be. The trick is to learn to be honest with ourselves and about the difference between how we act, the person we want to be, and the reality of who we are, warts and all. To grow, to come to wholeness, means being honest with ourselves about who we are in all reality. When we can see the difference between who we try to be and who we really are, then we can begin to rely on God's grace to accept ourselves as God accepts us. When we can come to a point where we are able to become more authentic and less like actors in the drama of our lives. So, standing behind the persona, the mask, is the ego. This is a fundamental psychological concept that in Latin simply means I. To simplify greatly, the ego is basically our sense of self. The ego is our fundamental sense of control, of identity, and worth. It is critical to point out that a strong, healthy ego, a good sense of self, is crucial to being able to function in the world. We need to see ourselves as capable people with gifts and strengths, knowing on a deep level that we are worthy of respect. These aspects of a strong, healthy ego are necessary to get through ordinary life. Without this basic ego strength, a positive sense of self, we wouldn't be able to face and cope with the many challenges and crises of everyday life. Not having a healthy ego can lead a person to become a human doormat, someone who is extremely reliant on other people for his or her sense of self. People who don't think they are competent, worthy people will find it extremely difficult to maintain jobs, relationships, to cope with the problems of everyday life as independent, functional adults. A crippling sense of inadequacy, of not being capable, is the result of the lack of a strong ego. It is important to note that this lack of a sufficiently developed sense of self, of a healthy ego, tends to be much more of a problem for women than men. Through the cultural messages that women receive, they are often taught not to think about themselves, to be so other-focused that they do not develop an adequate sense of their own needs and abilities. On the other hand, we have all known people whose sense of self, their regard for themselves, seems out of proportion to their actual abilities and gifts. Some people seem to have a very exaggerated sense of self-importance. They seem to think that they are much more important, gifted, or talented than the way they are perceived by other people. In popular usage, we think of these people as egocentric or egotistical. Perhaps we can think of the inflated ego as similar to the weeds that seem to take over a garden. An occasional dandelion might be pretty, but when they choke out all the other flowers, they become weeds. In the same way, a healthy ego is important and necessary, but an inflated ego takes over and chokes out sufficient room for others, for God, for anything other than the self. This egocentricity, exaggerated sense of self, has long been identified in spiritual traditions as a source of many problems. We see it most obviously in the idea of pride. Now, pride as simply claiming the reality of our accomplishments and gifts is not a problem. Pride becomes a problem when it is the expression of claiming more than is our due, thinking we are better, smarter, more accomplished than the people around us. Pride is when we start taking all the credit for ourselves rather than God and others. Egocentricity is described as self-will by Benedict. For Benedict and many spiritual authors, this means the state of living in the illusion that we are in control of our lives, rather than allowing God to be the center of our lives. The spiritual life is largely seen as the journey towards surrendering our false sense of self, our inflated ego, or for some people, the inadequate sense of self, the lack of a healthy ego, and coming to a new point of wholeness, a life made whole and transformed in God. At this point of wholeness, the individual no longer sees herself as either greater than she is or less than she is. Ultimately, we begin to see ourselves as we were meant to be, gifted, worthy, beloved people made in the image of God. We rejoice and celebrate who we are, as we are, beloved children of God. A critical part of psychological and spiritual growth is to learn and accept who we really are. This is both the hard part and also the essence of the journey. No matter what we say we believe, there is often a significant part of ourselves that believes that God or others won't really, truly love us if they were to really know who we are. We tend to think that we can only be acceptable, lovable, if we are someone, something different than who we really are. Part of the journey towards wholeness involves naming and integrating parts of ourselves that we don't like. We have said that we develop a persona, a mask or role, in order to feel adequate and competent. This is what our ego helps us to do. We work hard at behaving in a certain way. But when we over-identify with this persona, we begin to reject and repress parts of ourselves that don't conform to our expectations, our sense of who we should be, who we think we have to be. These rejected, repressed, unacceptable characteristics become part of our shadow, an aspect of our subconscious. If we think that it is not acceptable to be angry, assertive, vulnerable, or any other characteristics, then we push away these feelings and aspects of ourselves. This can also happen with positive characteristics. If we believe that it is unacceptable to be gentle or empathetic, then those characteristics are also repressed. Unfortunately, these characteristics do not disappear just because we don't like them and don't want to admit that they are part of who we are. For example, if we are raised in a home where it is important to be nice at all costs, then we may deny that we ever feel angry or irritable or frustrated. However, when we can't admit and claim those characteristics, then they tend to come out in unhealthy ways. The person who always has to be nice may engage in passive-aggressive behavior, never admitting that something is a problem, but conveniently forgetting to do things, making pointed remarks while denying that there is a problem, affecting an attitude of eternal suffering. We say that these repressed characteristics are part of the subconscious because we are able to get occasional glimpses of these parts of ourselves. We may notice a feeling that is hard to get hold of when we are repressing some part of ourselves. There is often some kind of brief glimpse of another part of ourselves, something that gives us pause, something that makes us wonder why we are reacting the way we are. Some of these insights can come in the symbolism of dreams. Sometimes we may think of an image or have a thought suddenly enter our mind. These are all things to pay close attention to. It is important not to dismiss these fleeting insights, since often they bear considerable wisdom and insight into our true nature if we pay close attention to them. Finally, the deepest layer in our psyche is the unconscious, the area of things that are beyond our awareness, that we are not able to see, forces that may have an impact on our life, but that we have no control over or awareness of. But the most important thing to remember is that for all of us, the power, the Spirit, the love of God is always present and working within us. Transformation is the work of God within us that we cooperate with. Transformation is the operation of God's grace. We can resist it and deny it, but God's presence and transforming power are always stronger than we are. The spiritual journey is about becoming conscious, aware of how God is inviting us to wholeness. We need to learn to pay attention to how we think, act, and react. We need to be aware of how our ego affects our thinking and behavior. We can begin to notice how threatened we get when we aren't in control. We can see how identified we are with a particular mask or sense that we have to behave in a certain way. If we pay attention, we can begin to notice the parts of ourselves that we deny and stuff into the closet, and how those same characteristics then reappear in subtle ways. Our goal in understanding the psychology behind spiritual development is that we are continually moving toward wholeness, toward the reality that we are the image of Christ. We are beloved children of God. The journey toward this goal is long, difficult, and painful. We have to recognize and integrate deeply wounded parts of ourselves and our past. We have to be painfully honest about the fact that we are not the people we want to be. But the key is always that grace and God's presence goes before us. God is always there, always welcoming us home. We talked earlier about the movement from orientation to disorientation to new orientation. This, of course, is the movement of grace. When we are going through periods of transition and crisis, it is our ego that is being threatened. The persona that we have carefully built up no longer works. The control that our ego craves doesn't work any longer. During times when we move from orientation to disorientation, when we have to face our shadows, the parts of ourselves that we have rejected, when we have to realize that we can no longer live our lives through sheer force of will, through the strength of our ego, then we are being given the invitation to open up, to allow God to be the center of our life. Through the crisis, we come to a place of new orientation, a place where a new reality of transformation is being born in our lives. This also, of course, is the goal of monastic life. Benedict didn't use the language of modern psychology, but these concepts are implicit throughout the rule. Monastic life is a journey toward allowing God to be the center of our life and away from the reality of the unhealthy ego. In the support of community, in the structures of prayer and worship, in the daily challenges of living with and for others, we experience a mirror that helps us see ourselves with honesty. When we see ourselves as we really are, we can also begin to see how God is working with us to bring us to wholeness. We will continue to explore how monastic life is a way of coming to wholeness and transformation as we explore further in the days ahead.